Hello, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be discussing how to ensure your NIST Special Publication 800-171. Yeah, so today we'll be discussing the NIST Special Publication 800-171 compliance for DoD contracts. We had a little technical difficulty there. I apologize for the pause in the presentation. So today we'll be talking about just a little bit about myself, Nigel Redrick, talk about IBSS's experience with NIST special publications, and specifically 800-171. And also, we'll be talking about exactly the meaning or the requirement of 800-171, any pain points that organizations face with implementing the 800-171 compliance requirements, and also any impacts of non-compliance, or some of the impacts of non-compliance. We'll discuss why you should prepare now, and we'll talk about how to prepare for NIST Special Publication 800-171 compliance, and we'll discuss next steps. So first, just a little bit about me. My name is Nigel Redrick, and I am the Director of Governance, Risk Management, Compliance Services at IBSS, and I've been with IBSS for a little over 8 years now. Now about IBSS. IBSS has been around since 1992, so a little over 32 years, and we have over 20 years of corporate DoD experience. Our experience includes performing gap analyses, which helps to identify any areas of improvement. We have experience with developing and helping to implement remediation plans to help address those gaps. We also have extensive experience with developing system security plans and creating plans of action and milestones in the event some controls in those plans cannot be implemented immediately. We also provide a suite of services related to continuous monitoring to ensure that management is aware of the security posture of the organization. And we also provide compliance training and support. So first, what is NIST 800-171? Well, NIST is the body that we'll say NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is the body which establishes standards for the United States federal government. In this instance, NIST has published 800-171 to provide recommendations to non-federal organizations who operate and maintain non-federal systems. Now, that's a distinction from federal organizations and federal systems. 800-171 has been designed and developed specifically for non-federal organizations and their systems, whereas 853 was established and published for federal organizations and federal systems. And the idea behind 800-171 is to ensure that controlled unclassified information is protected when it is processed, stored, and or transmitted by a non-federal information system or a non-federal organization. And 800-171 provides very detailed requirements for ensuring that those CUI needs are met. So what are some pain points? A lot of things that we're hearing regarding pain points as far as implementing 800-171, the primary ones relate to personnel. And a lot of organizations, while they do provide DoD services, they are not IT organizations. Hence, they don't have a large cybersecurity staff, if a cybersecurity staff at all. Secondly, in the event they do have cybersecurity staff, the familiarity with 800-171 is often lacking, and that could potentially be due to the lack of focus on governance, risk management, compliance. And also, one of the major barriers, a major pain point, is developing documentation to demonstrate compliance with 800-171. And a primary pain point is the System Security Plan, or the SSP, that was mentioned earlier. So what if you don't comply with 800-171 requirements? Well, first, as a DoD contractor, there are requirements spelled out in DFARS. And the DFARS, that is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations Supplement. All federal contractors must follow the FAR, which is a Federal Acquisition Regulation. DoD has a separate or a supplement to that called DFARS. So by not complying with 871, you are just automatically non-compliant with DFARS. And in the event that it is determined that you are not compliant as an organization, you could face debarment or suspension. Debarment meaning potentially not able to support the government for up to 3 years or more than 3 years, and suspension just not as much as a temporary period of time. Now, the damage to reputation comes as a result of potential breaches, which is mentioned in this last bullet. If you're not compliant with 800-171, your name could be included in a database of organizations that cannot bid on DoD contracts. And also, you just could make the news. So it's a great idea to go ahead and work on compliance with 800-171. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, a potential security breach. Now, often there's a discussion about compliance versus security. Now, that's beyond the scope of this presentation. However, complying with NIST Special Publication 800-171 certainly goes a long way to minimize potential breaches. So why should you comply now or prepare now? Well, first, DFARS requires it now. It is present in DoD contracts. So you certainly want to make sure that you are implementing 800-171 today. In addition to that, by implementing these requirements now, you're being proactive. We have a saying in cybersecurity that you want to build security in versus bolt security on. So you want to take proactive measures to make sure that you're implementing the security controls that are necessary to protect the CUI, or the Controlled Unclassified Information. Next, CMMC is right around the corner. The final ruling is expected to be published later this year, which means that CMMC requirements will be placed or could be placed in DoD contracts as early as January of 2025. So it's a great idea to start preparing now. And lastly, it's quite possible that several federal agencies will start requiring 800-171 for putting that in their contracts. To date, GSA and NASA do require the implementation of 800-171. So how to prepare for 800-171 compliance? Well, as a former IBSS executive, he and I often discuss, it's about the data. You want to find out where the data is located within your organization. Where is the data processed? Where is it stored? How is it transmitted? So in this instance, the data is the CUI. So where does CUI reside within your organization? You also want to conduct a risk assessment and just kind of do an internal look to determine how prepared you are to protect your CUI. So it's a great idea to conduct a risk assessment. That's something that IBSS can do. So feel free to contact us for that. Next, after completing your risk assessment, you want to make sure you implement the appropriate safeguards to protect the CUI. And by safeguards, we mean the security controls. The next step would be to validate that those controls are in place. It's not enough just to implement them. NIST has also published 800-171A. That publication is utilized to help prepare to assess the controls that are described in 800-171. So after implementing those controls, you then want to assess them. Now, the first step or recommendation that I have is to assess those controls internally. We'll call that a self-assessment, to determine whether or not you have adequately implemented the controls to protect CUI within your organization. Next, it'd be a great idea to contact a third party to validate that those controls are indeed implemented and operating as intended. And another step to include in preparing for compliance is to compile the artifacts. So when you are preparing for the assessment, actually we kind of go back as you're implementing these controls, start generating the artifacts then, when those artifacts are utilized for the assessment. And that way you have the artifacts available for subsequent assessments. So what are some next steps? Next steps we recommend, visit our landing page. You click on the link and you go to our landing page, and then you're able to contact us. Feel free to contact us for a free consultation, or you can send an email to us at NIST _ SP 800 171 at ibsscorp.com. I'll repeat that. It's NIST _ SP 800 171 at ibsscorp.com. Now, this is not our only webinar. In a month or so, we'll be presenting on how to develop a system security plan. As I mentioned, that is one of the key pain points for organizations. And our expertise in doing this for years with the United States federal government will certainly benefit you as a client. Now I'm available to answer any questions that anybody in the audience might have today. So as I look down in the chat, let's see. So the first question, do you provide training for our staff? Yes, we do. We have a cadre of cybersecurity professionals who are experts in implementing the NIST standards. And one of the things I did want to mention is that NIST 800-171 is actually a derivative of 853. So our experts are quite familiar, and I'll call them more than familiar. They are subject matter experts as it relates to 853. So by virtue of that being the case, 800-171 is a breeze for us. So yes, we do provide training. Just feel free to contact us. So the next question. They keep talking about these DoD compliance requirements. As a government contractor, do you really think we will need to comply within the next 2 years? So as it relates to 800-171, you need to comply now. As far as within the next 2 years, perhaps that question is geared towards CMMC. But as it relates to 800-171, you want to make sure that you are complying today. Next question. What is the starting point for NIST SP 800-171 compliance? Our recommendation is to perform a gap analysis to see where you are today. And by performing that gap analysis, that'll allow you to provide or to prepare a plan to move forward with implementing the controls necessary for 800-171 compliance. What are some best practices for remaining compliant with 800-171? Well, continuous monitoring, which I touched on briefly, is one of our areas of expertise. Continuous monitoring is a strategy or an approach that we recommend to remain compliant. And continuous monitoring means ensuring that we are aware of the controls that must be implemented, the status of the implementation, and whether or not as implemented, those controls are effective. So I would say that is probably the primary practice for remaining compliant is continuous monitoring. Next question. What steps should an organization take to implement the 800-171 requirements in a way that ensures that they pass an audit and obtain CMMC certification? As I alluded to a few moments ago, the first step would be to kind of identify where you are. So that would be your gap analysis. Gap analysis, you want to also conduct a risk assessment. And after doing so, you then want to start working on implementing any controls that you know for certain are not implemented. And after implementing those controls, the next step would be to perform a self-assessment. We don't recommend performing or requesting an external assessment until you have performed that internal assessment yourself. So go ahead and perform the internal assessment after implementing those controls. And once you're comfortable that you have implemented those controls to the best of your knowledge, then contact a third party to validate that. Now, as it relates to CMMC will require that third party validation anyway. Um, and not to detract too much from this, so CMMC actually came about um, not so much as a result of, but companies have often self self asserted their security posture, and breaches happen here and there. So DoD has decided that the CMMC certification would be necessary to have a third party to validate that those controls are implemented. And one other thing I did want to mention was um, the False Claims Act. Um, as it relates to self-asserting your security posture, you want to make sure that you're being totally truthful. DOJ some time ago passed something called the False Claims Act. So if a contractor will say lies about security posture, there could be potential penalties there. Another question: do you have a white paper that we can share? Um, so NIST actually recently revised 80171, is now at revision 3. So we're in the process now of developing a white paper that is aligned with that newest revision of 80171. See, next question. Is it expected that CMMC will ultimately supersede 80171, or are they likely to persist as independent requirements? So once the CMMC assessments start, they will be assessing the 80171 requirements. So the two are not mutually exclusive. So by implementing 871 controls and validating those controls are in place, you will be compliant with CMMC. So it's not so much that the 871 will go away. Now it might evolve with time, but 871 to date is the basis of CMMC. Let's see, another question. If the client has all their data on the cloud, does NIST provide guidance on the configuration of cloud services to minimize the risk of data breach? So NIST provides the standard or the special publications to protect systems. The federal government also has a program called FedRAMP. Now, FedRAMP is where organizations would go to get the guidance for protecting cloud systems. And by the way, those FedRAMP controls are based on the NIST 853 requirements. Next question. What are the implications of the new organization-defined parameters introduced in NIST 871 Revision 3, and how should small and medium-sized businesses prioritize their implementation to ensure compliance? So the implications are many. In the past, in 871 Revisions 2 and earlier versions, there was no requirement to define a parameter. And let me just briefly describe or provide an example of an organization-defined parameter. Um, an organization could suggest that what could be a requirement to make sure you have an access control policy. So that's just a requirement to have an access control policy. However, an organization-defined requirement would be how often would the organization review and update that policy? So the organization would actually define that. So that's an example of an organization-defined parameter. So the question is, what are the implications of what we'll call those ODPs that have been introduced in Rev 3? The implications are much of security documentation needs to be updated. As I just gave an example about the policies. So if you have policies that have not defined when they will be reviewed and updated, that's a matter there. In addition to that, as it relates to organization defined parameters, or ODPs, you also could have some system configuration changes that need to be made, because after performing a risk assessment and a gap analysis, and you determine that certain systems need to be reconfigured, and you might decide that you need to specify the parameters necessary to configure those systems in a manner that will mitigate the risk. And then the second part of that question is, how should SMBs prioritize their implementation to ensure compliance? The prioritization is based on your risk assessment. So the recommendation would be, when you perform the risk assessment and you want to prioritize your risk from highest to lowest, and that will then guide you as far as your implementation to ensure compliance. See, next question. Are there any anticipated updates or modifications to 801.71 that our organization should be aware of? What steps should we take to prepare for these changes, if any? Well, luckily, or somewhat luckily, 801.71 was recently revised and published in May of this year. So based on the pattern, organizations are in a good position to not have to worry about a new revision. Now, of course, that could change based on the threat landscape. But for now, I would say just probably have a couple of years before they worry about another, or be concerned about another revision. But the second part of that is, what steps should we take to prepare for these changes? My recommendation is to take a look at 853, because again, 801.71 is a derivative of 853. So if you stay on par with 853, you will likely be automatically aligned with 801.71. So it looks like that's the end of, or there are no more questions. Well, thank you for joining today, and stay tuned for our next webinar. I think it's scheduled for September 16th, where we'll be talking about how to develop a system security plan, and that's going to be a very detailed and exciting presentation. Thanks again for watching.